So my name's Bronwen Evans. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Speech, Hearing and Phonetic Sciences. I'm a phonetician and I'm interested in variability in the speech signal. So my big research question is really trying to understand how we hear through all of the variation that we have in speech in order to communicate effectively. So if you think about the speech signal that we hear all of the time, there's an awful lot of variation in it. So people come from different regional accent backgrounds. They might have a different first language to the one that you have as a listener. Even the same talker never produces the same, or hardly ever produces the same word in the same way. So to give you an example of that, if I took the word red, so the colour red, if I said you're wearing a red shirt, then that word red sounds very different to if I said, oh, you're holding a red book, where red sounds more like reb. So what I'm interested in is how people deal with all of that variability. How is it that despite all of this acoustic variability in the speech signal, how do we understand each other? And if that variability is in the signal, then that probably means that we as speakers can manipulate that variability in order to maybe sound more like somebody else, in order to get on with them better, or in order to make communication easier. So I'm also interested in understanding how people use variation in their speech production as well. So just to kind of pick on a few things that I think would be interesting, I've worked with Patty Adank looking at how an unfamiliar accent affects our comprehension. So whether or not somebody who speaks with an unfamiliar accent is really difficult to understand. And we all have that impression that when you kind of first go to Glasgow or Newcastle, where there's, say, if you're not a native, if you're not from that city, so if you're from the south of England and you go to Glasgow, it's often really difficult to tune in to the accent. And we did a study looking at trying to quantify exactly what the comprehension cost was, so what the processing cost was rather. And we found that there certainly is a processing cost associated with processing an unfamiliar accent. But if you have some level of exposure to that accent, then you start to get a lot better. And in fact, if a Glaswegian person is listening to standard Southern British English, then they perform equally as well with their own accent as they do with standard Southern British English. So familiarity seems to be an important factor somewhere. And I'm actually following that up with a grant with Paul Iverson and Melanie Pinney at the moment, where we're trying to look at why standard accents like standard Southern British English seem to be so intelligible in comparison to other regional accents. So although we know that each person has an advantage for their own regional accent, they also seem to do incredibly well with standard accents, and people have found similar results in America as well. So general American seems to be intelligible, highly intelligible to everybody, regardless of whether they're speakers of that variety or whether or not they're speakers of, say, Texan or something. So the idea that we're trying to test is that these standard accents might be somehow prototypical, so that they might somehow occupy a space in the kind of acoustic, they might occupy a part of the acoustic space which is somehow more intelligible to everybody. And that has kind of interesting implications for not just for psychology, but also thinking about theories of language change and sociolinguistic aspects of speech. I think my research is important to society because it addresses a fundamental aspect of what it is to be a human being, which is how we communicate with each other. And my research in particular looks at how we deal with variation, and that's a big part of our increasingly global community. So if you look, if you go back in history, sort of 100 years or so ago, my grandpa's generation rarely moved out of a particular area. So they worked, they lived in the same area, they came into contact with people who were from a very similar language background to them. So probably the variation that they heard was much more limited. There would have been variation, of course, but it was probably much more limited than what we hear now. So if you think of London in the 21st century, it's is a very vibrant, multicultural city. There are lots of different languages spoken. People come from all over the world and from all different parts of the UK, and somehow we all have to communicate with each other.